Hello and welcome, everyone. We're really glad to have you here today for the next session in our series, Day One and Beyond, which is taking you through a different series of topics and activities related to building out on Oracle Cloud. For anyone who might be new to these events, welcome. We're hosted on Cloud Customer Connect, which is our Oracle community forum for end users. And I'll be sharing some resources for you that, if you do not already have an account there, will lead you to create that free account, and you can join in discussions, post questions, look for upcoming events on all kinds of topics and similar resources there. My name is Kenna Kettrick. I'm a program manager with the OCI go-to-market team. And today I'm joined by the original Day One and Beyond team, Jeremy Walker, Master Principal Cloud Architect, and Larry Beausoleil, Cloud Engineering Senior Enablement Manager. And we're going to walk through the OCI Best Practices and how they can impact you as you build out on the cloud and some of the things we've been talking about so far. Larry, go ahead. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Awesome. Thanks, Kenna. Welcome, everybody, to our Day One and Beyond Best Practices framework. This is going to be a fun one. You know, if you joined us for the cloud adoption framework talk, this is going to be kind of a continuation on, you know, where you're at in the cloud, what it looks like. I'm joined today with Jeremy Walker. Hey, Jeremy, how's it going today?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is definitely going. I'm excited about today. You're right. This is going to be a fun one. You mentioned CAF, and you're right. This is a logical next step. Going through CAF, we walk you through the journey of how to plan, how to start your rollout into the cloud. Going into best practices, this is how do you operate in the cloud safely, efficiently, cost efficiently, both and then also operationally efficient as well. And so this is a lot of information. We're going to try to cram a lot of information in a small amount of time and hit the high points. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to this. This is actually a framework that right when I started here at Oracle, I helped contribute to, so that I really like the idea of having this out there. This is something available to everyone. We're just going to go through it. And so everyone here, please take advantage of this resource. Publicize it within your organizations, within your enterprises, as one is continually growing, and also as just that benchmark, so that you can make sure that you're on top of how you should be operating in the cloud. So, like you said, it's a fun one. It's an important conversation to be having, and I'm excited about it.
Definitely, yeah. And there's some pieces before we jump into this framework that we want to talk about. You know, first of all, what's our agenda for today? What are we talking about? We are going to dive into best practice framework for Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. Inside of that, some of the areas that we want to focus on is the personas. You know, I get asked this question from a lot of customers. You know, if we transition to cloud, you know, what are the personas that are going to be acting upon the cloud? And you know, what skill sets do I have to transition? I've worked with a few customers on this, where we discuss, you know, certification prep. We discuss a lot of things to make sure that they have the right skill set, because it's the same titles, same everything. It's just a matter of what are you doing in the cloud. And instead of going in and racking and stacking a server, I go and click and launch a server, or I go and create Terraform to actually work on, create the infrastructure for what I'm doing. So it makes it a lot easier. But these are some of the things that we want to focus on in the areas of application for this, which is security and compliance. And security is a big one. I think I've talked about security in every single one of these conversations we've had, Jeremy. And I know that you, as well as I, see it as a benefit, even though I know you're a developer, so you're like, security. If I have to, I have to. But then we get into the reliability and resilience, and how do we actually implement that? How do we make sure that we're doing that correctly? How do we make sure we're following those core best practices? And there's sometimes that you'll hear myself and others in the cloud industry say, well, it does depend. And there is a little bit of variance when we discuss these topics. And that really comes down to, what are your requirements? Once you look at your requirement sheet, then it's a matter of, what security do I have to implement? What level of SLA do I have to meet? What, performance? And there is that standard of, I can have it very performant and I can have it cost optimized to a point. You can't have everything when you're building this out. And so how do you make sure that you have all the components to meet that bill of materials, that solution you're trying to have? And then we get into operational efficiencies. And then you've probably seen this before because we talk about this each time, and it's just to kind of reiterate some of the things that we have for complete cloud service. The ones that I really like to build out and talk about, I like the networking, the security part. Jeremy, what's your favorite ones that you kind of work with day in and day out now?
Yeah, and the thing with OCI is that it is this full-featured cloud platform, this public cloud platform, which is, when you talk about Oracle Cloud, a lot of times what comes to mind is SaaS, Exadata, XCS, things that the Oracle services that are endemic to enterprise operations. And in most of those cases, best practices have to do with that front end interface or just interfacing with those products through portals or through the APIs or what have you. These services lead directly into why do we have this best practices on Oracle Cloud? It's to make sure that all of these tools, you mentioned my favorites. My favorites are the ones that you can manipulate and that you can build most with, which you're typically your serverless, your coding, your containerization services. These are ones that you need to have the most control around and the most an operating model to interface with across the company, so that yes, you can take advantage of these building tools, but also make sure that they're within guardrails and that it's done in a way that's auditable and monitorable and secure. And so that's my favorites. Like you mentioned, coming from the develop background, I want to build, I want to take advantage of these services. But from an enterprise standpoint, there's so many risk and considerations that you have to take control and handle of, and how do we provide for those? And that goes into the conversation today.
Definitely. And it's something that when we talk about these services, a lot of what we're talking about for best practices and just the conversations we've had in the past are kind of woven into how we create our products here, to making sure, as a developer, you don't have to worry about the security component as much. And I put an asterisk to as much because a lot of that's implemented into it. When we talk about networking, a lot of the security components are implemented into it, and it's by default that it's there. So let's kind of continue on to the piece that gets into more of the best practices and understanding here. We talk about managing the compliance and what's your responsibility as a customer versus what's Oracle's responsibility, and how do we meet this and make sure that you're getting the best product you can, and it's implemented in a way that you feel meets your requirements. And this is where we kind of progress left to right on this particular slide, where if you were on-prem, you're taking care of everything. And as we start pushing this over to Oracle, you're having Oracle kind of take more of that responsibility on, and gives you some of the convenience of, this act and iterate approach, and getting into a model where it's like, hey, we can just continuously deploy. We can try new things quicker. And this helps when you're talking about like migrating your workloads from on-prem into the cloud, because you can do, lift and shifts, lift and refactor. There's so many different ways to actually implement and get these into the cloud easy. But it's also, is it done in a way that, let's say you need to move it around or adjust it? Well, you can. And that's one of the things I like to talk about, is the fact that we do use Terraform, which is an open source product. We do use other tools that kind of help you put the data the way you want it to be seen. We have lots of different database offerings, lots of different ways to implement this. When we look at infrastructure as a service here, this is something that you're taking care of the guest OS and up. But, we have customers that come to us and say, hey, I actually want to run my own hypervisor, or I need to, I have a legacy app that I need to run. And there's bare metal for that. As you move forward, it's what are you taking care of? What are you owning, and what are you responsible for? And the one thing that's continuous across the board is your data and making sure that your data is implemented in a best practice manner. And we'll talk about that as we kind of go through the framework today. Along with the kind of shared responsibility, the compliance model here, it's the where are we at? And there is this page can be found on our public docs as well. But it's, what locations can you launch in? And this and Jeremy, feel free to chime in, but this is something that also gets you closer to your customer base. And this is another best practice because it's part of the performance, it's part of security, it's part of compliance. There's a lot of different things that come into play of, can I build in the location I need to build in near my customer base to give them the best possible experience while meeting compliance requirements, because I only can deploy in the US, or I can only deploy that in the country in which that application is meant to be in. There's a lot of different things there.
Yeah, and I was going to say, the reason this slide is here in this talk is it shows what the expanse of responsibility is, the footprint of your new data center within the OCI cloud. And as the great philosopher Uncle Ben said, with great power comes great responsibility. And so one of the key factors here that we mentioned is that operational efficiency. How do you manage a data tier or an infrastructure that is global in all of these places where you have such great possibility to expand and grow and take advantage of these resources you otherwise would not have access to in your colo or your own data center. And so that's why it's important to have these best practices. It's why it's important to follow the CAF through your journey, is because yes, with Oracle Cloud, you have footprints, or the ability to have a footprint all over the planet. But how do you manage that at that scale with a team that you have when you're going from maybe one colo, maybe 5 or 6 data centers that you're used to managing? So how do you manage that? So that's what hopefully we'll address and put some of those fears at ease and get more comfortable with the ability to manage a cloud presence.
Yeah, and if there's any questions along the way, feel free to throw them in the Q&A, because we're definitely, this is part of why we're doing this. We want to make sure that there's involvement from all of you out there that are listening to this. The piece we're going to jump into now is basically our talk. This is the link. This is the best practice framework for Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, and this is something that let me switch over to that real quick so we can start talking about it, Jeremy.
Yeah, and as you pull it up, I want to say, like I said, I was privileged to participate in version 2 and half of version 3 of this best practices, I guess, culmination of ideas. And the thing to take away from this is not a static document. This is constantly building. As one, for security aspects, new threats are identified. We're updating this document as we have new services come available to address those threats, or new services available to assist with cost management or to assist with manageability. This document is being updated. So it is something to have a good reference to have at your fingertips, or even reference in your corporate documentation, so that as you grow in the cloud, as your presence and footprint grows in the cloud, you have that resource available to say, are we following the right path? Are we going in the right direction, taking the right steps to operate efficiently, securely in the cloud? And so that's just something to take in consideration as we go through this.
Yeah, and one of the things that I like about this doc is a lot of the stuff we're talking about here actually ties to one of our services that's inside the console. So we do have what's called Cloud Advisor, and this is running through some checks and checks in your account to make sure are you set up for reliability and resilience? Are you set up for cost optimization? Are you running the most performance, or do you just have services that are just sitting there and should be terminated or destroyed? So I'm actually currently working with that team and talking to them about what are the checks, how is that process through, because I think it's something that there's a lot of services. And I know when I first got into cloud 10 years ago now, I think it's been, it was something, you look at all these services, and we had, you had a fair amount of services, and then it expanded, and then it keeps expanding and keeps expanding. And you can't, you have to put the monitoring services in place, and then you have to make sure that your security is in place. But it's nice to have kind of that automated check of, hey, just so you know, you have a block volume that hasn't been touched in a few months. It might be worthwhile to just back that up and delete it, so you save some money. A lot of those things you can't entirely do on-prem, because if you have a server that's just sitting there running idle, it's consuming power, it's consuming space. But the nice thing about these best practices and how it gets implemented, if you don't need it, destroy it, remove it, back it up, and then have a Terraform script if you need to relaunch it. Working with some customers, it's like, well, we only run this one report once a month. Well, in that other days in the month, stop it or just back it up and just create an environment in that once a month time. All right. So the best practices piece here, I just want to read this first part and let everybody kind of look through it, and then we'll dive into kind of the personas. But Oracle Cloud Infrastructure provides infrastructure and platform services for a wide range of enterprise workloads. In each service, you can choose from a rich array of features based on your goals. Oracle recommends a set of best practices to design and operate cloud topologies that deliver the maximum business value. And that's something that, how do you design and operate the cloud? And this design portion here, Jeremy and I are going to talk about in our next talk. We're going to talk about best practices when it comes to architecture and design. But this is something that, when we start going through this, the security and compliance, there's a reason that this is one of the first pieces that pops up. Security is first and foremost. If you don't have security, you don't have an application. And so how do we make sure we apply best practices?
Yep. And then security also, you're going to see pop up in every other facet as well. It's its own bullet point, and then you're going to see it pop up in each of the other bullet points as well, because it's job 0, job 1, whatever the buzzword is, but it is something they're going to see constantly referred back to as we go along.
Yep. And when we look at the security and compliance, we talk about user authentication. And Jeremy, what are some forms of user authentication we should think about when we're looking at security?
Yeah, and as we dive deeper into each of these forms, we'll start picking out some of these. But one of some topics to run off is to have specific users for specific goals. Should be obvious. Things such as MFA on each user, so that you have that extra layer of protection. And then there's something that's fairly new. It's not new, but should be used across the cloud, is the idea of temporary credentials. Long-lived credentials will get you in trouble. They get shared, they get checked into source code. You want to make sure that you have timelines and limitations on your credentials, so that they don't, let's say, come back to bite you if someone leaves the company, or if they get checked into source code. As I said, things to consider as we go along.
And one item I want to hit on there is, if you go back to the map, so just picture the map in your head of how many regions we have. Another way to kind of isolate kind of that authentication portion is your keys should be somewhat region specific as well. There's things that you want to start implementing, saying, oh, I want to be able to log into Virginia region or Phoenix region, wherever I'm at. You have a key for those regions, so that way, if there's a compromise to one key, it's not compromising everything. When we get into reliability and resilience, we have ways to build fault-tolerant network architectures, and this is something that this is always a fun conversation, fun topic of high availability, fault tolerance, and resilience, and how do we build that redundancy into our systems? And in some cases, it's built in because you are going to the cloud. In other cases, you have to have backups. You have to create other instances, create multiple applications to meet those requirements that you have. And then getting into kind of the performance and cost optimization, the compute sizing. So there's a lot more flexibility because, if you go from on-prem, I have this server, I split it up using some sort of hypervisor, and I have my compute spacing. But now you can say, well, I only need one VM or two VMs, or I can even break it down even further and use Kubernetes and use serverless, as Jeremy was talking about. And the storage strategy, that's something that I can put those particular resources in object storage because maybe I don't need them accessed all the time, or I don't need a certain level of IO traffic for those storage devices. So there's different ways to meet those requirements. Operational efficiency, the deployment strategy. This is something that when you start looking at cloud, and it kind of blends from the CAF right here, where it's what are we actually deploying? Is this the correct way to deploy it? Are we, how are we staging out our deployment process? Do we have the correct resources at our company to assist us in this particular model? All right, and personas. So I know this is something, Jeremy, I'm gonna slowly go through these. I'm gonna let you hit on the application architect. So I know this is gonna be a fun start.
Oh yeah, no. So and that's as we go through. I know you and I were talking before this. As we go through these personas, the first few, when you think of cloud, are fairly common sense. You're going to have an application architect that's utilizing the services that are newly available to the cloud. They're going to be interfacing with systems that previously, again, on-prem, were either thrown over a wall, handled by an ops team or deployment or SRE team, something like that, or they previously didn't have access to, such as networking topography. So you're going to have cloud architects and application architects that are going to, one, need to be educated on things like firewalls and security stances for accessibility to data. And so when you come across this application cloud architect, this is a new role that previously was undefined on-prem. You had developers, they would write code, hand it to your deployment team. In the cloud environment, because of, we'll talk about best practice later, because of things like scalability, things like the whole DevOps model, where you integrate your development platform, developing out the resources you need for your applications. Your application developers, your cloud architects are going to have that new mesh of responsibilities for not only securing their own applications, but also securing access, securing data, making sure that their data is encrypted and least accessible, and accessible on a need basis, but also, that their code, as it's being deployed more frequently and they have more accessibility to it, is that much more secure. And that lends itself to tooling and things of that nature that we can apply on top of this, that's built into the platform, to make sure that, you mentioned Terraform, the idea of this application or infrastructure as code, as well as your application code, you can treat all those things the same and have that mechanized, automated process for deployments and security and auditability built in as you build all this out. And so that's something that, again, previously you didn't have to consider. With this new cloud model, you have application and cloud architects needing that more depth, the new definition of a full stack developer. And then that leads us into that next persona, which is the DevOps architect. What is, again, DevOps is something you had on-prem, the tooling developer, but now with the cloud, it's much more fluid, much more deep as far as the development that the operation teams have involvement with. Building out structures like serverless and containerization, like you mentioned, is something that previously you would have a DevOps team that would manage manifest and securities for maybe your VMware stack or your Hyper-V stack. Now they're building out Kubernetes and container platforms, and they have to know dependencies and build structures and build pipelines. So these are things that, again, they need to have the education, they need to have the certifications, as we mentioned, to manage those new responsibilities in this new cloud environment. I'm going to pause there because that's something that, again, I go through all those application responsibilities have now blended through the stack, where previously there was clearly defined lines. Now there's a whole blend as it goes from code deployment down through the infrastructure stack.
Yeah, there's definitely a blend, and this is why a lot of companies that we talk to, they have cloud teams that have someone from each one of these personas, or someone that's kind of helping with this to make sure that it's still implemented correctly. It's, you have someone from networking, you have your DevOps architect, you have your enterprise architect, you have maybe an infrastructure architect, and we call out these different ones, a security architect, because you still have to have those when you start building out. It's not something that the roles go away. It's a matter of what tools do they have access to now to work on this particular project. All right, let's start getting into the security and compliance and some of the best practices there. Right before we do that, we have that question. I think you start typing an answer, but does OCI support integration with Okta for token-based authentication, OAuth 2.0?
Yeah, and I was going to say it does. So we have the native Okta authentication. We also have authentication through Federation and even MFA passing as well for several third-party vendors. Again, going back to a standard integration with most cloud providers. We also have IDCS, which is our main front end integration for not just federation, but access management to the cloud. So there's several different ones. I actually have, I was pulling up a document that I can share that walks through federating with Okta. So I'll send that out shortly as well.
Awesome. And there's kind of built-in support if you want to use, if you're using anything with SAML 2.0, we have our IDCS that's basically merged with identity and access management on our platform. But yeah, let's get into security. So the effectiveness strategy for security and compliance. So create a design strategy. So this is something that, again, we don't go straight into building when we start talking about prod environments. But if you're doing a proof of concept, build, create, destroy, do everything in the account. You can create a compartment inside of your tenancy, and later on, if you're like, hey, we're done with this, there's ways to have Terraform kind of review that compartment, see everything that's in there, and link it to a Terraform script so that you can destroy it and make it easy, or tag all those resources. But when you get into this design strategy, protection of assets by placing controls on network traffic, how do we do that? So what are the ways we can actually implement traffic control? And that's with our subnets. And we have two options for how our subnets are deployed. It's availability domain specific, or you can have it spanning all the ADs in a region. If we have a security list at our subnet, and then a network security group at the particular resource level, that's another way to kind of isolate those, making sure it's a public or private subnet. So that's starting to isolate that. How we're actually routing the traffic, so we can have a lot of our resources in a private subnet, have a load balancer in front of it, or we can have our configuration where all those private resources are going out a NAT to actually get to the internet if need be. We can protect the front end of the application with a web application firewall, and some of these are dependent on the application you're deploying as to which one you're doing. So this is where what am I building? If I'm building a 3-tier architecture, in that three-tier architecture, like we talked about last time, you're going to have a public and private subnet. You're going to have isolation between your private subnet resources. You're going to have a service gateway so that you can go from the private subnet to the backend APIs that you need to for our services, as opposed to routing out through the internet. And so there's just different ways, and the way I like to think about it from a network standpoint and just like a security standpoint is it's like an onion. When you cut into it, it has multiple layers in your security setup. You'd have CloudGuard for monitoring, making sure that all of those tools are implemented so you can see what's going on inside of the account, what's happening from I authenticated in, am I authorized to do what I'm doing, and keep going down the list. Yeah,
and that's and what this gets to, I know a lot of times when people think of security in the cloud, their mind immediately goes to IAM, to let's secure the front door. But it really is that design for attack. You design the full stack. Like you mentioned, we have the services along the line, the whole way down the line to, yes, secure the front end. IAM strategy is important. There's a lot of documentation out there. We have videos, and we've talked about it, you and I have, about securing that IAM. But as far as practicing like the operating practice within OCI for security, it doesn't stop at IAM. It's much bigger, and it is identifying these places in your architecture where there's opportunity for either manipulation, there's opportunity for bad actors to take advantage of holes, and that design, that day one design, is what prevents those holes. It's very hard to go back and analyze, an entire infrastructure for security flaws. So at day one, as you're designing it, again, it goes back to how do you build it out? Embrace automation. Automation is what's going to allow you to manage the security across the cloud at scale from the get-go. You build it out with code. You can audit that code. You can review it, and it also makes it repeatable. It removes that human aspect, the human interaction, as well as influence, as well as the human error, just fat fingering a command or a configuration. And so that's something where when you start from scratch designing for security, it really starts, it makes it easier down the road to plug, to make it so when those holes don't exist. And so there's a lot that we can go through here. I wish we can go through all of it. There's some points here that I would like to key off of. One of them is that you get with the cloud is organization of resources. We kind of mentioned that, and it's something where we've talked about it earlier, Larry. We mentioned tenancies, and we mentioned compartments and tagging. Those are tools within the platform that allow you to separate out your resources and define where they exist. Make sure that, one, they're separated from each other, and two, separated from any possible attacks. Again, using IAM policies, using the way that you organize, segment, and distribute your resources, you get that security through obfuscation, as you would. That's something that you can do with cloud. You can separate out. You're not limited to a physical space. You have all these tools available to you. The other two is data and monitor. But I want to pause there and see, what do you think about the whole concept of the presence, or the organizational structure of cloud, and how it leans into the design aspect of the cloud presence, or your infrastructure as a whole?
There's a lot to break apart there.
Back there, yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot. I would love, like I said, we could spend an hour on just the security aspect, but yeah, this idea of designing for the attack, knowing that it's coming, and we'll probably hopefully touch on it a bit later on. You also design for failure. In the same way you design for failure, you design for this attack, whether it's whether it's ransomware, which has become very prevalent, or whether it's your DDoS, or whether it's an internal actor. You need to take all that into consideration. And as what you see there, leverage your native controls that are provided by OCI. You mentioned CloudGuard. There's also different tools for auditing. There's different tools for alerting. And then you have that, all that culminates to an operating model that allows you to maintain control and have that scaled out view of your environments.
Well, so going to like the attacker and leveraging native controls, I mean, thinking through this from I can test scalability of my infrastructure. Going for this one, like designing for attackers, having a known good traffic state. How much traffic is my application supposed to receive on a day-to-day basis? Is it, one request to, 1,000 requests? And then you can start putting, leveraging more of these controls around the monitoring. So you can say, oh, well, this is, normal traffic and this spiked. So that's not normal. We need to check into that. Or you need to have after reaching this particular level, it starts shutting things off or blocking. And I know that term shutting things off might be scary. So it's something that I'm not saying go in and just like terminate the application. I'm saying going in and having like Apache, there's a way if I have so many concurrent sessions from a particular IP, I can have it start stopping things or blocking that particular traffic. And there's ways to kind of enforce that particular setup with WAF and our firewall rules that you can create. So there's a lot of different ways to actually kind of set this up.
Yep. And then that leads into, there's a point down there is monitor and audit your environment. What you just said, you can't do any of that unless you know what your environment is supposed to look like. And that's a big part of it, where you have, you collect your data, you collect logging, you collect your logs and performance metrics, as you will, but you also need to collect and be able to act on things that aren't supposed to be there, like like Larry said, what is the traffic income supposed to look like? Monitor it and then have controls or alerts built in to react to that, so that you have a reactive control. Your operational team is notified, and then you have automated responses to those intrusions or to those events. And so that's something that's a complete cloud operating model has. Like I said, those front end systems with AI or IAM, it has the operational controls from managing the deployments, managing the build out, but also the monitoring and alerting policies on the back end to know what the environment's supposed to look like, and any anomalies are immediately recognized and reported on, and you have the ability to act on them.
And one thing I want to highlight here, and this is something that we've talked about in the past. We did 2 talks on this with a couple experts from Oracle, and that is zero trust security model. This, after we talked about everything for security and compliance, there's a paper around zero trust and understanding this deeper. And we talked to a couple individuals that wrote that paper and discuss it. That's kind of the core concept when it comes to security. It's huge. There's so many different things that we should definitely run through. I do want to have us take a little pause from this because we do have some questions here that I want to continue getting those answered real quick. All right, so Jeremy, you got the finish on the login for Okta for token based, and then that's also capable for auth tokens, correct? To your knowledge?
Yes, to my knowledge, I've got some documentation that I can set out regarding the web tokens. I know we have it through certain front end services. I'm not familiar if IDCS does that natively, so I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, so we'll confirm that, and that's something that if we don't give you a specific answer right now, Jeremy and myself we'll go back and find the links, find the resources, and gather them gather them up for those particular questions. All right, so the next question. All right, so moving from EBS on-prem to OCI, post-migration, what all best practices are advised by Oracle to help manage customer application effectively, both performance and cost-wise? So we do have I'm pretty sure we have a migration doc on EBS on-prem to OCI that kind of goes into this particular piece of what needs to be implemented, monitoring security-wise. So I will find that one, and I'll grab the link and kind of I'll send it out for this particular question. Jeremy, any thoughts you want to add to that one? I know we have some doc on it.
Yeah, and with a lot of the EBS migrations I've been involved with, it's not just EBS, and so this best practices and as it goes into cost management as well, it does lend itself to some of those situations. And then EBS working with when we have a great EBS migration team that can definitely address a lot of those concerns. We've done hundreds of these migrations, and we have a long use case library to address what's the best way to set that up with Oracle specific and non-Oracle workloads as well. So we can definitely point you in that direction. Should be able to speak to either your cloud rep or your EBS rep to get you in touch with our internal EBS migration team to get a lot of that addressed.
Yep, definitely. All right. How do I secure my Oracle Identity Service where IDP is Okta integrated through SAML? Off the top of my head, you have your policies that you would be setting up specifically for your groups that are linked up to your IDP. I guess it just depends, and I'm not sure if you added a later question on this. So I think it's how do I secure Oracle Identity Service where IDP is Okta integrated through SAML for my EBS apps using Asserter. So there's two items, and I know in IDCS there's a way to actually limit access limit access to resources and configure policies for groups, policies for what applications a user can actually connect to. So we can definitely grab that link on what to do there. Jeremy, any other thoughts?
Yeah, and a lot of this specific use case, we can definitely follow up, and there's definitely documentation out there on IDCS and the identity service, and also it's changing very recently. A lot of capabilities and feature sets have been added to it, and so there's a lot of new documentation coming out for integrations, both external and internal, for third-party apps, as well as internal services or internal Oracle products as well. And so that's something to consider. That's something to definitely follow up with on a case-by-case basis. Okta, again, is pretty standard, and I know Okta has documentation on interfacing with OCI, and I believe we have a walkthrough as well.
Yep, we'll work on getting those links for those questions. All right, and then the last question, and then we'll go back into a couple more best practice pieces. So typically one would think of OCI best practice scopes being limited to IaaS and PaaS, but Oracle SaaS solutions migrating to Gen 2, do these best practices anticipate SaaS as being included in that scope? I don't know that we directly call out SaaS in this doc, and Jeremy, definitely correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think it's something that the best practice is kind of encompassing around, whatever you need to log into in the cloud, whatever you need to access in the cloud, and if it doesn't clearly say do this for SaaS, I know that there are going to be subsequent articles around what needs to be implemented. If you're looking at, and this goes into the architectural design piece. So if you have a specific SaaS piece that you're using, there's going to be a doc that says this is what you need to check to meet these compliances, or this is what you need to do to make sure that your authentication to this application is done correct. But yeah, what are your thoughts, Jeremy, on that?
Yeah, I know our SaaS team has a lot of that, like you said, per product, and this is mainly geared at the platform usage, like that responsibility model we mentioned. SaaS limits it to kind of the consumer, and per SaaS offering, there's going to be best practices and ways to interface and interact with it. I know it does depend on to what level of interface or interaction you have based on the SaaS offering. And so, like I said, there's certain best practices regarding accessibility in this that's going to apply, but each SaaS offering is going to have a different, like you mentioned, a different scope for how to best apply security practices as well as operational practices for SaaS interactions.
All right, let's get back to the doc a little bit here now that we've gone through a few of the questions. So we talked about the security portion. We've talked about managing identities and authorization policies, and there's a lot here. It's not enforced use of MFA, and this is something that with IDCS and the way it's set up, you can enforce your MFA policies. Don't use tenancy administrator account for day-to-day operations. I mean, this one right here, I've seen it happen. I mean, I can't deny that I've done it here and there. But it's something that this should be something that you have a least privilege principle process or policy implemented when you're accessing it.
Yeah, and I know we're coming up pretty close on time, and there's a lot of these that just need to get, they're one-offs. And I say one-offs. They're one sentence descriptions of do this, and it's something you definitely need to go through as you're building out your tenancy, as you're building out your cloud ecosystem. I know we're coming up close. I want to be able to touch on like the other three big ones. And there's some key points we could take away. Like security is a huge part of it, and it's a part that is touched on each of the other key principles. But it's one that, again, there's a lot of information here that needs to be delved through by. We mentioned the personas, each of those personas, so that they're aware of the best practices for each of their responsibilities and their roles. But yeah, and then like you mentioned, with there's things like that where you have the administrator user who, you don't need to have that sitting out there used day to day, because it goes back to that least privilege. You should have roles that are being used for the purpose that they were created. So developers need only developer access, network admins need only network access and infrastructure access, and so much so on.
And that's getting in. It leans a little bit towards this isolating resources and control access. That's why we have compartments, and you implement your tagging for your policies, so you can say, this is what can be accessed, or this is what this is what can be seen at what time by what user. Role-based access control. So who, what service can access it. Don't use users' credentials in a compute instance. This is something that you can give a compute resource access to run API calls if needed. And then securing your database. This is, locking it down from a network aspect, restricting permissions, and deleting database resources. If it's not in use, delete it. And then understanding like our policies here. So we have example best practice policies that you can come and grab here and start from when you're building this out. And this is just allow group DB users to manage DB systems in tenancy And then you can have your where condition of, you know, what is not allowed, or what don't you want to have happen. Making sure that there's applying security patches and in a timely manner. And a lot of these, you know, a lot of these are probably something that a lot of you are already implementing. One of the things that I also bring up when we're talking, when you get into something like applying security patches, what's your rollback procedure? What's your test procedure? You know, those are also other parts of best practices when you're implementing this. It's not a matter of click and deploy, because we've probably all been there where we, you know, launch a patch and they're like, I didn't realize that was going to, you know, mess up the application a little bit there. So it's something that definitely have some of those change management procedures in place before some of this stuff is implemented, so you know what to do when you need to roll back. But we are very close on time here, and I want to make sure that if there's any other questions, we have a little bit of time to help answer those. Jeremy, any final thoughts before we hand it back to Kenna?
No, this, like I said, this document should be, you know, a good reference material for anyone operating. There's a lot of material here to go through. And like I said, the persona is given a good idea of what needs to be gone through by whom. And there's, like I said, there's 3 other, you know, large good segments that we can delve into at a later date. That is good. The whole reliability aspect, you know, designing for reliability, fault tolerance. There's the idea of performance and cost management. That is something where a lot of enterprises get hung up on, where migrating to the cloud doesn't save money. You don't save money migrating to the cloud. You save money operating in the cloud. And so this is certain good steps to follow as you're implementing your cloud model and making sure that you follow the best practices so that you do get the most out of your cloud experience. And then finally, that operational efficiency. How do you get your team to, one, be properly equipped to run workloads, to manage workloads at scale, so that you don't have to hire an army of people to manage an infrastructure and manage applications and manage security. How do you enable your team to manage the cloud environments that they've been charged with? And it talks about training. It goes into tooling and things of that nature. So like I said, this is definitely something that you should go through, definitely with your cloud team, definitely your CCOE, but also your developers and your DevOps and your network admins as well, so that you have that full stack knowledge of how you should be running and what you should be running in the cloud.
Well, Jeremy, it's been fun, and I think this is a conversation like we both talked about that we could talk about for days, because there's a lot to really unpack in this particular document. But with that said, thank you for talking with me today, Jeremy, and I will hand it back to Kenna.
Excellent. Thanks so much, both of you. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and being here. And as mentioned before, we are going to be sharing out those resources, the link to that best practice document that Larry and Jeremy were talking through, and a couple other resources that were mentioned as well. So there'll be plenty of time to dive into that on your own at a later date if you want to do a little more. A lot of these sessions are just kind of scratching the surface of what's available and the kind of best practices and frameworks and situations to adopt all of these things. So there's a lot more to look into. And we're going to have Larry and Jeremy back for more to look into a lot more of that as well. But for now, thank you so much to both of you for presenting. Thank you to our audience for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day, everybody.